Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Several major politicians in Europe have announced this week that negotiations for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, have collapsed. Germany's Vice Chancellor and Economics Minister Sigmar Gabriel said, and I quote, "In my opinion, the negotiations with the United States have de facto failed, even though nobody is really admitting it." Similarly, President François Hollande of France said something similar. Let's take a look.
La négociation s'est enlisée, les positions n'ont pas été respectées, le déséquilibre est évident. Alors, le mieux, c'est que nous en fassions lucidement le constat et plutôt que de prolonger une discussion qui, sur ces bases, ne peut pas aboutir, mieux vaut faire en sorte que nous puissions avertir les uns et les autres que la France ne pourra pas approuver un accord qui aura été ainsi préparé sans les bases indispensables pour une conclusion positive.
Critics of the TTIP have long argued that the deal would undermine national sovereignty and give corporations the ability to sue governments for imposing environmental or workplace regulations that would harm their profitability. Joining us now from London to take a closer look at what happened with TTIP negotiations is Nick Dearden. Nick is the director of Global Justice Now, a UK-based social justice organization that has been organizing against the TTIP. Thank you so much for joining us, Nick.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, Nick, after 3 years of negotiations of TTIP, 27 chapters of discussions have all come away, and apparently the TTIP has failed. Do you buy that?
I think what's happened is the sheer outpouring of public anxiety, concern and anger from across Europe and the United States on TTIP has meant that they simply can't continue. And what they've been forced to do, because what they see now is that the anger over TTIP and the anti-TTIP campaign are threatening the entire agenda of what they call free trade agreements. There are several other free trade agreements that they're also trying to negotiate at the moment. And so by taking away the most controversial of them, by sacrificing that one, if you like, they're hoping that they may still be able to get some remnant of this enormous, what we call a corporate offensive, corporate takeover plan through the European Parliament. So as we see it, it is something to be celebrated. It's a great victory. We never thought that 3 years ago, when nobody had really heard of TTIP, we never thought we would be here in 3 years' time celebrating its demise. I think we are, and I think that's a good thing. So we're going to celebrate that. But at the same time, it's not quite time to put our placards and campaign postcards away. There's a big fight still to be had.
Right. And Global Justice Now and Greenpeace, who carried out a very effective campaign. First, I should congratulate you guys for this. And second, I also know that the secrecy with which TTIP was negotiated was effectively countered by Greenpeace when they managed to access a draft of the treaty that was in negotiation, and they actually projected it onto the Parliament building with the faces of all the people that were part of the negotiations and discussions from the corporate sector, so that everybody came to know, and the profile was high, which I'm sure gave way to defeating it, at least in the way they're articulating it now. And surely it should be celebrated. However, as you said, there's some other agreements in the works that should also concern us. So tell us about them.
Yeah, so really this project they call them trade deals, but really it's not very much about, us selling coffee and you selling clothes or something like that. You know, it's not really what most people think about of as trade. Really, what it's about is rewriting the rules of the global economy to suit big business, big corporations, and that's a direct threat to our public services, our environmental regulation, our ability to protect the less vulnerable, the more vulnerable in our society, our democracy as a whole. And there were four components. One was TTIP, the most controversial. The other, which is better known in North America, is the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But there's also two others, CETA, which is a Canadian EU deal, which is at a critical stage of negotiations. They're hoping to ratify that within the next 12 months, and that's the one they're really worried about. And then TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement, which covers all services from finance through telecommunications, postal services, transportation, right through to health and education. So massive super privatization, super liberalization treaty, which has about 50 countries involved in it. And they're particularly concerned about CETA. CETA just hasn't attracted the same amount of opposition here as TTIP has. And I think that's largely because people view Canada as a society and economy slightly more like Europe than the United States is, and so they've been less worried. The case we've made is this isn't about whether we want to be more like Canadians or more like Americans. This is about big business getting its way and people losing their control of their society. So that's the case we've got to make now with CETA. They thought CETA was safe, but what was starting to happen in the last 2 months, 3 months, was that the anti-TTIP campaign was actually starting to drag CETA down with it as well, because, as we said, this really is TTIP by the back door. If you're worried about big business suing our government for introducing regulations that protect the environment, that protect our society, or that they were democratically elected to carry out, then exactly the same thing will happen under CETA. Canadian multinationals will be able to do the same thing, but also American multinationals that have subsidiaries in Canada, and that's tens of thousands of corporate entities, will also be able to take those kind of actions. So CETA itself was starting to be a contested territory, and every week you saw a new parliament or a new government minister somewhere in Europe saying, we're not so sure about this. So they were really worried. So what they're hoping is, by taking this tactical retreat from TTIP, they will be able to get CETA through by the end of the year or early next year, and it's our job to try and make sure they don't.
Nick, the level of sophisticated resistance that the Global Justice Now and the Greenpeace in Europe has managed to mount against TTIP, do you think you'll be able to sustain this kind of resistance and energy for the other trade deals that's coming?
I think it will be. I think this is just too big a movement now to suddenly collapse because we've won on one front. This is one of the biggest movements in European history. I mean, over 3 million people signed a petition in just a 12-month period saying we don't like TTIP and we don't like CETA. That was always part of it. There are hundreds, thousands actually, of local authorities, municipal governments right across Europe that have declared themselves TTIP and CETA free zones. So I don't think this is going away. There are networks of people who care about food, student networks, and so on, all opposed to TTIP, and that's going to have an effect on CETA too, because you see, the reason there was so much opposition around TTIP wasn't just because it was a trade deal that we didn't think we were going to do well out of. It was a fundamental symbol of how our whole economy has been geared up to meeting corporate interests, to making corporate profits above everything else. And the rights, so-called rights of corporations to go where they want and do what they want and invest however they want, that's come in our economy to trump human rights, the right to a decent, dignified life with housing, water, all the other things that you need. And I think TTIP was simply a symbol of that, that appeared at the right time. And our job now is to make sure that people aren't hoodwinked into just going home and thinking everything's okay, then we stop that trade deal, but to actually go on, to stop these other trade deals and to do more than that, to start thinking again about how we can build an economy that really is controlled by ordinary citizens and benefits ordinary citizens and creates more equality, creates a more climate-friendly form of industry and so on.
Now, Nick, there's a very interesting development here in the U.S., and that is the Democratic Party's president, President Obama, Obama wants to fast-track TPP and get it through before he leaves office. Now, this week we've had some by-elections in the United States, and a number of people that support the fast track has been re-elected to govern here. Do you think that has any significance in terms of the kind of resistance that the people can mount against TPP, as you have done in Europe?
Well, look, I mean, I wouldn't for a moment imagine that every parliamentarian that we've got, even on the social democratic side, is up in arms about TTIP. I mean, it has been a tremendous piece of work to try to convince the majority of MPs representing the Labour Party, our official opposition, that TTIP's a bad thing. That's not how it started. And there are many people still in the Labour Party who are elected representatives who still don't think it's a bad thing. So, you know, there's probably not as much difference as you imagine there. The thing that's really struck me, and I think it's also had a feedback mechanism here in terms of our campaign in Europe, is the way that in the primaries in the US before the presidential election, trade became an enormous issue, whereby ordinary people said, you know, for the first time that I can remember, these deals that you've done don't represent our interests. They've impoverished certain parts of our country. Inequality's grown. You know, there's a real concern amongst American workers, in the same way as I think there is amongst workers in Europe, that these trade deals are done in the interests of a very small section of society. And the way that came through in the primaries it made a huge difference, because all of a sudden European politicians who wanted this were looking across the Atlantic and saying, well, are we going to be able to get this through? Even if we can pass it through the European Parliament, will it pass through the United States President and Congress? And so that's been really big. And I know that you know, Hillary Clinton is by nature a free trader and likes these kind of deals. But I mean, the fact that even she's been forced to backtrack on TTIP and on TPP, I think is really significant. And I think what it suggests is that we're coming to an end of the era of what we call neoliberalism, or this phase of highly financialized capitalism, which has created so many social and environmental and economic problems. And we need to look for an alternative. Now, the problem for those of us who are on the left of the political spectrum is creating an alternative that resonates with ordinary people, because if we don't do that, it isn't going to be more of the same. It isn't going to be more trade agreements like TTIP. It's going to be the kind of economic nationalism that Donald Trump represents and that the far right across Europe represent. They've jumped on the anti-TTIP bandwagon as well. And they're putting forward a set of policies which are absolutely anathema to the kind of better world we want to build. So the onus is on us now, not just to oppose and defeat these things, but actually to start creating a more democratic economy and society. And there are examples of that going on all over the place. You know, people reclaiming their food system from big agro-business, people starting up socially minded banks, people trying to take back energy companies into public ownership and running it on a fairer and more environmentally sustainable basis. This is happening all over the place, but it needs to be connected up into a bigger program that resonates with huge numbers of people in our society who feel quite rightly marginalized by the economy that we've been living under for the last 40 years.
All right, Nick, very informative. And again, congratulations. And we look forward to hearing from you again.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.